Hello again, and welcome back to Educator.com's Introduction to PHP course. In today's lesson, we're going to be talking about the concept known as variable scope. Specifically, we're going to be talking about what variable scope is. We're going to be talking about a special keyword in PHP, the global keyword. We're going to go into more detail about superglobals, which is something we've mentioned when we've talked about the underscore get and underscore server superglobal arrays that we've used in previous lessons. We're going to talk more about actually what superglobals are. We're going to talk about some of the pitfalls of using what are known as global variables. We're going to talk about when variables are to be defined, and then we're going to finish up with an example that shows that basically puts all together all of the stuff that we've learned in the lesson, and then quickly just talk about something that doesn't fall under variable scope but is a related issue, and it's called function scope. So what is variable scope? Well, essentially variable scope refers to what part of a script a variable is accessible. So for example, when we define a variable in our script, for example, if we define a variable a equals 1, it's available within all of our script. So far, all of the variables we've defined in our scripts have been what are known as global variables and had what is known as global scope. And what that means is once they're defined, they're able to be used anywhere within the file. And it also can be used within any include files. So for example, on our web application where we define the page title attribute, the page title variable, when we include our header file, it actually can access that page title variable and use it because it's called being within its scope. It's a global variable, so it's available to the entire script and any of its include files. However, now that we've introduced user-defined functions, variables defined in functions have what's known as a different scope. It's called local function scope. And that basically affects the ability to use variables defined in your script within a function and variables defined within a function within the script. And the reason is because they're known as scoping rules. Essentially, any variables that are defined within a function have local function scope, and they can only be accessed from within the function. And this includes function parameters. So let's take a look at a file called scope.php. We have a couple of functions here that we're going to get to in a sec. The first thing I'm going to do is, in our script, we have two functions defined up here, and then we have a variable assignment statement that declares a variable we're calling global int equals 25. And basically, because it's defined in the main script, as mentioned, just like all of our other variables we've been working with, it's a global variable, so it's accessible anywhere in the script. So when I type echo global int, PHP is going to know what that variable responds to. That variable is going to have scope, and PHP is going to know where to find its value. So when I go ahead and load the page, it'll output 25. Now, however, let's say this function up here that we've created is called change global int. And for example, let's say we want to run this function and then change the value of this global integer from 25 to 0. And that's what this function is going to do. Well, two things to note. First thing is that if we go ahead and run this function, and then we echo global int again, we're going to see that it does not get updated. The reason is global int is defined in the global scope, and so it has global scope. But once you enter into a function, those global variables are no longer available. So even though we're referring to global int, which was previously defined in the script, and we're going to set it to 0, this global int is actually almost kind of like its own separate variable. It only works within the function body, and it doesn't affect this global variable described out here, or defined out here. This global int, even though it has the same name, is actually a local function variable. So again, all we're doing here is actually changing the value, or setting the local function variable global int to 0. The change doesn't get made. So here, when we echo global int, it's going to show 25. When we run the function that's going to try to change the value, it's not going to work, and so we're still going to see that global int outputs 25 as well. Let me just include a break statement here. So when we go and run the file, we see that 25 is output twice. And again, the reason for that is that within a function, you cannot access global variables. At the same time, let's say we wanted to, not only can you not change them, but you can't access them either, or to output them. So for example, let's say we wanted to echo global int. Now one would think, okay, we've run our script, we've set global int to 25, we've output it, we call this function, and the first statement in the function is echo global int. Well, we think global int is set to 25, it should output it. Well, as we'll see, that's not going to be the case. We're actually going to get a warning, or a notice, and it's going to say that you have an undefined variable global int. And that's because within this function, global int had yet to be defined, and within a function, it doesn't know about global variables. So the other side of that is that in the global scope, you don't have access to functions or to variables defined within within a function. So for example, we have a function here called local scope. Takes in one parameter, and it creates a variable called local int equals 100. Now this is a local function variable, and what that means is because it's defined within the function, it's not available here in the outside script. So even if we were to erase this, even if we were to attempt to access this variable outside of the function, it wouldn't work, even if we've already called the function. So for example, if we go ahead and call the function local scope, let's just input a string that says hello. Now we'd call this function, it would get run, it would create this variable local int equals 100, and then if we tried to echo that local variable out here, we're actually going to get an error because it's defined within the function, it has only function scope, it's not accessible outside the function. So when we run this, we're actually going to get another notice. And it's going to say undefined variable local int on line 35. If we look at line 35, that's in our global scope within the bigger script outside of the function. It doesn't know what local int refers to. At the same time, we can't access, for example, we couldn't output param. Even though within the function we could echo param that was passed in, and that'll work because parameters defined within a function are variables are only available within that function. So it knows about what param is. It's whatever value it was set to when the function was called, in this case hello. It'll be able to echo it. But if we go down here and we try to echo it, it's not going to happen because param only exists within the function. So for example, if we run the script, we'll see that hello was output, and then we get an error on line 36. So if we look back, hello gets output because this echo statement knows what param is because it's been defined within the function scope. However, we get an error here because we're trying to access the variable param that's only defined within the scope of the function. So that's basically the difference between global scope and local function scope. Now PHP does provide a way of being able to access global variables within functions and function variables in the global scope. And it does so via the keyword global. And basically what that does is you can declare a variable within a function and prepend it with this keyword global, and that's basically saying that anytime you access that variable within that function, you're going to be referring to the global version of that variable. And you need to do it by declaring it again with the global keyword first. So for example, if we look at a script called global keyword.php, we have a function defined called access global, which we're going to get to in a second. But what we do is we define a global integer again, a global variable called global int 25, and then we echo that value, and we say in global scope, global int equals the value of it, which is going to equal 25 because we're in the global scope, it knows about that variable. Now when we call this function access global, and we go up here and in the first line we try to output global int, it doesn't know what global int is because it hasn't been defined within that local function scope yet, and it doesn't have access to global variables. However, if we were to go ahead and then sort of redefine the variable by calling the variable name that we want to use, that's a global variable, and prepending it with the keyword global and then a space, then when we access or try to use the variable global int within the function, it's going to know that we're referring to the global variable global int. So this echo statement, where we're trying to echo global int, will actually work because this is the function now knows that global int refers to this global access variable. In addition, the other thing we can do is because now global int within the function refers to the global variable, we can actually change the value of the global variable within the function. We can set it equal to 0. And so after this function ends, when we try to output global int again, it's not going to be 25 anymore. It's going to be 0. So if we go ahead and run this function, we're going to see a couple of things. Excuse me, run this script, we're going to see a couple of things. First off, we're going to see that the first output, global int equals 25. And that comes from this first statement here, where we're in the global scope and we're able to output this global integer. Now, access global, the first thing it tries to do is access and output that global int. But it doesn't exist because it's in the global scope and it doesn't know about global scope variables. So we actually get this undefined variable on line 19. It says global int is undefined. And when it tries to output it, it outputs a blank because it has no value for it. If we go back and look at line 19, this is where it's trying to access that global variable. However, now that we've declared it here as a global variable, this echo statement actually works. And so when we look back at our script, we can see the second statement, in access global, after the declaration global int with the global keyword, it's going to actually output the value global int equals 25. You also notice that because global int refers to the global variable global int now, because of this keyword, we can change the value of it. And so when we change it to 0 here and we access it again outside the function after the function's been called, its value is going to be updated. And that's why you see the output here. In the global scope, global int is now equal to 0. So now we're going to talk about superglobals, which again is a topic we've kind of talked about a little bit before with get and server variables. Basically, a superglobals are predefined associative arrays by PHP that are always available in any scope. They're available in global scope and within function scope, which means what that means is that you can use it because they're global. You can use them in the script in the global scope of the script without problem because they are a global variable. Within a function, normally, as we just saw, you need to specify with the keyword global in order to use a global variable. Well, global keywords, or excuse me, superglobals have the advantage of you don't actually have to specify the global keyword before using them in the function, like you would any other global variable. Additionally, we're going to introduce a new superglobal called globals. Interestingly enough, and what that superglobal contains, it's an associative array that contains all of the global variables currently defined within your script. And that actually allows you a way to access global variables, another way to access global variables within a function. Because we know that we can't access global variables within a function without using the global keyword. However, we know that we just learned that superglobals are available everywhere. And because superglobals, or excuse me, the globals superglobal array contains all of the global variables available, we can use that to access a global variable in the function. I know it's a lot to kind of soak in. A lot of global words being thrown around. Essentially, the way the globals array works is that the keys of the array are the identifiers or the names of all of the current global variables. And the values associated with those keys is just the current values of those global variables. One other thing to mention is that constants in a way are essentially kind of like superglobals in that they're always available in all scopes. They're available within function scopes. They're available within global scope. And like superglobals, you don't have to declare them within a function using the global keyword. The way that they're not like superglobals is that they're not predefined by PHP. So let's go take a look at a script that makes use of superglobals. here we have a couple of functions at the top that we're going to talk about in a second. So basically, here we are at the beginning of our script. We're in the global scope. We're not inside a function. And we're going to output the value of the superglobal variable server document root. And what that's going to show is that this superglobal is available within the global scope. So when we go ahead and we run the script, the first output we should see is in the global scope server.document root equals this. Now the next thing we do is we call a function called useServer. And if we look up at the useServer function, it says inside useServer, and it outputs the value of server document root. Now because server underscore server is a superglobal variable which is available in all scopes, we can access it within the function without using the global keyword, and so it should actually output its value. And when we look at the output, just to refresh it, we can see that the second output statement says inside useServer, server document root equals so and so, and that shows you that you can access those superglobal variables within a function or in the global scope. The other thing I want to demonstrate is the use of the globals, superglobal, that we had just talked about. So for example, if we define this global variable, it's called global int, and we set it equal to 25, and then we call the useGlobals function. If we look up at useGlobals, what it does is it's saying, it's basically trying to output the value of that global int variable. Now normally you'd have to declare the variable within the function using the global keyword. However, because all global variables are available within the global superarray, we can actually get access to it. And the way you do that is you access the globals superglobal array, and what you do is you specify the name globals, and then you use as the key the name of the global variable that you want to output. And this is using the complex curly bracket notation. And basically what this is saying is I want to get the value of the global variable called global int. And because globals is available everywhere, because it's super global, you shouldn't get an error here, and this should work, and it should output the value 25. So when we go and look at our script, we can see that it says in the function useGlobals, this variable here, global int of the global array equals 25. And the other thing is to just demonstrate about constants. We define a constant in the global scope called pi, and then we're going to output, try to output that constant within the global scope, and we're going to see that that works because constants have global scope, which means they can be used or have scope everywhere, which means they can be used within functions or within the global scope. So this is going to work, and then when we call the function useConstant, if we look up at useConstant, it's going to try to output the constant defined in the global scope. Because constants have scope everywhere, it's going to work and we'll have access to it. And so when we look at our output, we can see in the global scope, constant pi equals this value. In useConstant function, it has the same value, which shows that you can access that constant within the global scope or within local function scope. So we've introduced global variables, and now I just want to talk about some of the pitfalls of using global variables within functions. In general, accessing global variables from within your functions should be avoided. Instead, if you need to use the value of a global variable, you can pass it into the function as a parameter. There's a couple of reasons for that, mainly being that by not accessing global variables within your functions, you can increase the reusability, portability, and maintainability of your code. And the reason for that is, first off, by not using global variables, it eliminates a function's dependencies on a particular global variable. So for example, let's say you have the function, like a function we just had, or a function named test, and we access the global variable. Maybe there's a global variable that exists that's just called A. So if we run that function test and we use it to access a global variable A, as long as A is available as a global variable, that function is going to work. Now, one of the reasons we create functions is to be able to reuse them. So let's say we put that function in a function library and we move it to our new web application. In our new web application, maybe this variable A is no longer called A, it's called B. now that function is not going to work anymore because it's going to try to access the global variable a that doesn't exist. So when you include global variables within a function, you're basically creating dependencies on those global variables existing, reducing the ability to reuse your code and to sort of port it to other applications. The other thing it does is by using global variables in functions, or by not using them in functions, it reduces your debugging difficulties related to global variables being unexpectedly edited. So for example, if within a function we're using the global variable a, and we're doing some processing on a, we expect a to be whatever the value is when the function started. Now let's say within our function we go off and we call another function, let's say it's called function test. Maybe the test function is written by someone else, and it actually goes out and changes the value of a. Now if we're sort of to go further down our script and to try and access the a and say output, or excuse me, let's say we want to echo a, we may have a problem because we expect a to have the value that it had when we first defined the global variable when we entered the function. But another function, because it's a global variable, might actually go ahead and change that variable. So it can sort of have unintended consequences, and that can cause a problem. And that's going to make things harder to debug because you have to go and actually look at all the other code to see if they any of the other functions you use actually go ahead and access those global variables. In some cases, which we're going to see more in the advanced class, using global variables within functions cannot be avoided. And when that happens, you want to make sure that you document these functions extremely well because that lets any programmers that are going to be using those functions know that there's a dependency on global variables. So if they want to use that function, they have to make sure that those global variables exist. So just quickly want to mention about when variables can be defined. Basically, you need to define, and we've kind of seen this implicitly and haven't really talked about it explicitly. Basically, a variable, in order to use it, it must be defined before it can be used. And this includes, as we just saw, using global variables within a function. If you want to access a global variable within a function, if you're not using the global superglobal array, you need to prepend it with the global keyword. And that's basically sort of declaring the variable to be available for use in that function. And as we saw when we tried to access a global variable from within a function without using the global keyword, essentially that variable hadn't been defined yet, and so that's how we saw that we got an error. So I just want to show sort of one final example that puts all of this together that we've learned about. We've learned about global variables. We've learned about local variables, which are created within functions. We've formally defined what the superglobals are. We've talked about the scope as they relate to constants. And then we're also going to show how scope applies to using variables within include files. So if we go and look at this, there's a script called scope recap. At the beginning of this page, it includes a library called testlib.php, and it has a couple of test functions that we're going to use in the main script. The first thing we do in the beginning of the script is we define a global integer and we define a global constant. And then we're going to show through 3 echo statements that you can access all of these variables within the global scope. One, you can directly access it using global int. The other one is because it's a global variable, it's contained in the global super global array, so you can access it this way as well. And because constants are available in all scopes, you will be able to output the constant variable. So if we go and look at scope recap and load it, we can see at the beginning global variable and constant access in global scope. And we can see that in the global scope, we can access global int and it's equal to 100. We can access it via the globals array. And then in the global scope, we also have access to the constant because constants are declared. Now the other thing that we've done in this file is shown how scope is affected in include files. And essentially an include file is just basically considered part of the PHP file it's included in. So any variables that are used in that are globally scoped variables. So if we include this file called testinclude.php, which basically does the same echo statements we just did. It tries to echo the global int variable, just directly accessing it. It tries to access it using the global's superglobal, and then it tries to access the constant pi. Because it's included inline with that file, it has access to all of those global variables. It's not defined within a function, and so all of these should be able to output the correct value. So when we look at our file and output, we can see in the include file, we have the same output as up here. Global int equals to 100. We can access it by the global's array, and it equals the right value. And we can also access the variable pi. The next sort of test we're going to do is trying to access global variables in a function where we don't use the global keyword. So we've defined a function in our test lib called non-global test. And basically what that says is it has a string. It tries to create a string that directly accesses this global int. And we haven't used the global keyword within our function to define that variable. So global int, as far as the function is concerned, doesn't exist. So it's actually going to generate an error. And then we're just going to echo what the error message is. And if we look at the page, we can see that global variable access in non-global test in that function, it generates an error that says it's an undefined variable global int. So now what we're going to do is define another function called global test. And what we're going to show is that you can actually access that global variable, as we had learned, if we declare it using the global keyword. And so once we've made this declaration here that global int refers to the global variable global int, we can directly use the variable. Additionally, we're going to show that you can access the global int variable using the global superarray. And we're also going to show that within a function you can access constants, because constants have global scope. So in scope recap, if we look down and we run global test, we can see that in the function global test, global int equals 100 when we prepend it with the global keyword, which means it's giving its access to the global variable. We can access the variable using the global superarray, and we can also see that the constant is available within the function. We've also defined a function called local test, which has a parameter that gets passed in, and it defines a local variable. And in the function, it outputs the value of the parameter passed in, and it outputs the value of the local variable. And this is going to show that because local var is defined within the function and param is defined as part of the function's parameter list, they're going to be available within that function, so these outputs should work. So in scope recap, when we call local test with this function, with this string param value, we can see that in local test, local var equals local, which is the value we had set it to within the function, and we can see that param has the value param value, which is passed in. Now, just to show the other side of it, in the global scope, now we're going to try to output the variables that were defined in the function, the local var variable, and then also the param variable, which is defined as part of the function. And we're going to see, you can see here we have error suppression operators because they're going to generate a warning because those variables aren't available, and it's just going to output them, and basically it's going to say these variables don't exist within the scope. And as you can see, it says undefined variable local var, undefined variable param. So this is sort of an example that you can look at and see all the different interactions, how scope interacts in all sorts of different ways when using functions, when using constants, when using superglobals. Being able to access function variables outside of functions, being able to access variables within include files, and so forth. And it kind of sums everything up. So just quickly mention, it doesn't fall under the function of variable scope, but because we're talking about scope, I want to mention that functions have a scope as well. Function has a name, which is an identifier, and as we know with variables, variable scope defines where that identifier has meaning, where you can use that identifier. Well, functions in general have global scope, just like constants and superglobals. They're available everywhere. So you can call a function within the global part of your script, or you can call it within another function. It also can be called within any include files that you include within your main file. And the main thing about it is because they have global scope, they never need to be defined with the keyword global. So for today's homework challenge, I want you to get a little practice with trying to understand this scope concept that we've introduced. I'd like you to create a script that defines a variable and a constant. And when you define them in the main script, that means that those variables have global scope. And then I want you to go ahead and output them to show that within the script you have access to those variables. Then define a function that takes one parameter and also defines one local variable within its function body. And then what I want you to do is within the function also try to output the global variable that you defined in step 1 without using the global keyword or without using the global array. And what you should see is that you should get an error that you're not able to access that. Then go ahead and use both the global keyword and the global superglobal to access that variable, that global variable from within the function to show that, to give you practice with using the global keyword and the superglobals array. Also, try outputting the constant that you defined in your main script from within the function to show that constants have global scope and they're available in the function as well. Then, because the function has a parameter and a locally defined variable, I want you to output both the parameter and that locally defined variable from within the function. That's going to show you that these function variables, including the parameter, have scope within the function. And then try outputting the function parameter and its local, the variable that you created locally within the function, outside the function after the function has been called within global scope, and you'll see that you should get an error because those those variables have local function scope and are not available in the global scope. So that ends today's lesson. Thank you for watching Educator.com. Look forward to seeing you next time.